This episode of Retrosaurus is brought to you by Nicholas Topher. Come unleash the bees on Twitch and YouTube. Welcome to Retrosaurus, my name is Lou, and today we're going to complain about remakes. Remakes. With two high-profile remakes of classic games on the horizon, I thought this would be a good time to examine remakes as a concept. Why are certain classic games chosen for remakes? How are they changed and retooled to appeal to a new generation of players around the world? Do the advancements in technology dictate how a game is developed and presented? To understand these questions, our focus today will be on the different ways Capcom has used the Resident Evil series to explore these ideas. Why have some entries simply been given HD 4K Director's Cut remasters, and others from the ground up remakes? The answer could be as simple as money. In general, publishers and developers alike are always looking to land the next big hit from their studios to keep their IPs, their intellectual properties, aka the games they own, fresh, relevant, and modern while keeping their fan bases happy. They also need to attract new players without alienating them with high-numbered sequels or lengthy or otherwise confusing subtitles. For example, let's look at Kingdom Hearts. Without googling it, can you tell me how many games are in the series? What if we only counted main series entries? Then there are only 3, right? No, not at all. There are around 10 main entries, give or take a stray decimal point, then several mobile titles, an animated movie, and several compilations with unique content or enhancements. Now, if I were a casual fan of this series, that number alone would be too daunting to even consider approaching it. And given how Square Enix likes to title their games nowadays, you really can't tell if it's a spin-off, a main series game, or something else entirely just by hearing that name. What does Kingdom Hearts 0.2 Birth by Sleep, a fragmentary passage even mean? But let's move on. Now that Resident Evil 3's remake is coming out in a few short days, it feels like the perfect time to revisit the remakes of the first and second titles in the series, given how differently they approach remaking a classic game for a new generation. How did they succeed? How did they fail? What should be changed and what should remain the same? Let's simplify all these questions down to a single concise thought. Is a game that completely reimagines a classic title inferior or superior to a faithful remake? And to answer that, I ask you to join me as we enter the survival horror. Good luck. The original Resident Evil trilogy is no stranger to ports, director's cuts, and remasters. Known as Biohazard in Japan, was initially conceived as a remake of the granddaddy of the survival horror genre, Sweet Home. This title was never released in the West and was actually a tie-in with the film of the same name. And I've never actually seen that movie myself, but I've been told it's worth your time if you're even remotely interested in J-horror films. This Famicom title is an interesting blend of RPG and horror elements that takes some time to get used to. Personally, I've never put more than a few minutes into the game, but there is a pretty good translation available on the internet, and if you're really into horror and RPGs, it'll be right up your alley. But the Resident Evil we've come to know and love could not be any more different. It features 3D models, pre-rendered backgrounds, tank controls, real-time action gameplay, and a unique identity of its own. The original game even features an Oscar-worthy live-action opening with some of the best acting you can even find in the 90s.
No! Don't go!
And don't forget the unforgettable bangers in the audio department. And that's just a taste of the pure, unfiltered horror the series has to offer. So what makes Resident Evil? As the series did not change much between releases until around Gun Survivor, we'll look at the original trilogy as a singular unit. The core components of our analyses will be story, gameplay, and tone. So first let's tackle the story. It's your basic evil corporation plot with hilariously bad dialogue. The canonical plotline of this series is essentially the horror equivalent of Kingdom Hearts. The characters have as little characterization as necessary, and nearly everything is blamed on a different secret branch or mastermind of a now defunct pharmaceutical company, only mentioned when the plot needs a villain. There's always an outbreak, a link to Umbrella, and a virus. It more or less follows the same formula to make for a pretentious big brain Bioshock Infinite ending. But if there's one thing the series did contribute to gaming, it was their focus on establishing memorable characters. Jill and Claire were strong, capable female heroes, while Chris, Leon, and Barry gave us a nice spectrum ranging from meatheads to lovable dad joke slinging goofballs. Heck, we even got Wesker, one of the most ridiculous and memorable villains in gaming.
Ah, come on now, Kyo. Aren't you forgetting your favorite character, Rebecca?
Now, how about the gameplay? Tank-controlled action, pre-rendered backgrounds, and fixed camera angles. These three aspects together create the sense of tension and fear the games are known for. You never know what's lurking behind that door, nor what's right over there off screen behind a scene transition. For many, this combination is as scary as it is infuriating. The movement and gameplay is a bit clunky and unintuitive for a broad audience, although to their credit, they did tighten the controls and movement with each release. Yet somehow this series maintained this design through the release of Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 in 2004. And finally, let's talk about the tone of the series. Now, one thing the series has long been known for is its campy, awkwardly written, and acted out dialogue. Although it wasn't intentional, the voice acting and live action scenes of the original game were performed by amateur actors who were not even completely aware of what they were making. Really, look this one up. Most of them had no idea they were making something for a video game, much less Resident Evil. Although each game had marked improvements over the previous in terms of quality, both writing and acting wise. Each game is filled with unforgettable one-liners that are quoted by fans to this day.
Sorry about that, babe.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
I'd rather starve to death in here than be eaten by one of those undead monsters!
Ultimately, the series would undergo a massive retooling in all three aspects of these with the release of Resident Evil 4 in 2005. Years of experimentation resulted in the births of several new IPs in the process, and paved the way for a second trilogy of sorts for the series. Now, RE4 was released a skosh under 3 years after the remake of the original. So what happened? Did the remake fail to capture the essence of the original? What caused the 2002 release and its inseparable prequel to be the final nails in the coffin for the Resident Evil we knew and loved? The remake of RE1 was released exclusively on the Nintendo GameCube in 2002, alongside re-releases of RE2, 3, Code Veronica X, and the long-awaited prequel, Resident Evil 0. A game so unnecessary, the title reflects the score it deserved. This was part of a collaborative effort between Nintendo and Capcom that would see the GameCube as the new home for the series, leading up to the release of Resident Evil 4 alongside 4 additional Capcom games known affectionately as the Capcom 5. The series even got a subtle rebranding with all new titles in the series being written entirely in lowercase letters. This was intended to be the mark of a new era for the series, and a promise from Nintendo to show it had third-party support and mature titles. With this came the tonal shift the series has slowly adopted over time to break away from the B-movie feel the series was known for. So what changed from the original? As for the story, it's relatively the same, 2 scenarios, Jill and Chris, but they expanded the lore in the mansion. The story did receive quite a bit of changes that expanded the lore that was already there, allegedly integrating aspects from the cutting room floor while extrapolating on the Trevor family. The roaming, monstrous Lisa Trevor was added alongside her own subplot and location in the Spencer mansion to make her presence feel organic, as if she had always been there. That aside, the story is relatively unchanged with only those minor bits being added in. Gameplay-wise, same tank-controlled action, pre-rendered backgrounds, fixed camera angles. It's essentially the same on paper as the original. Same controls and presentation, though the additional areas offered new camera angles and areas to explore. Tank controls are still present, but with the subsequent HD remaster of this game adding a more fluid movement that breaks the game in a way, newer players are able to enjoy a more modern control scheme. They also added a new sub-weapon system that gave each character a pair of defense items in the event they were grabbed. New enemy types in the form of Crimson Heads made their debut, making you reconsider if killing an enemy is worth your time, ammo, and kerosene. Now, these changes may not seem massive, but the quality of life improvements over previous entries almost made exploring the familiar Spencer Mansion seem fresh again. And finally, the tone. Now, this is the biggest change that really cemented the new direction the series was headed. Gone were the cheesy yet memorable lines, persistent music, and bright aesthetics of the old Spencer Mansion. Characters now felt more like real people, or as close as you could get in this scenario. The art was completely redesigned to give a moody feel that recreated the tension, with atmospheric sound design making every footstep, growl, crack of lightning, and shattering of glass fill you with the fear that you were about to die. So the question is, was this remake successful? As a player, I think this game went above and beyond to bring back the same fear you felt as a kid when you encountered that first zombie munching on Kenneth in the hallway. It changed up just enough with the puzzles and flow of exploration that felt completely new yet still familiar. This was even one of the first games I learned how to speedrun because I loved it so much. That being said, it is definitely necessary to mention the sales figures for this game were fairly abysmal despite its critical success, prompting Capcom to shift gears entirely and move towards a more actiony style we see in Resident Evil 4. So despite the praise it earned, it definitely sent a signal that players had grown tired of the series, so they need to adapt to survive this horrible situation, and these changes came with a hefty price. The one aspect of Resident Evil that I absolutely love is the campiness the series features in nearly every title. Sure, there are some campy moments, but nothing that makes you scream, "Wow, what a mansion," when you see them. This was the beginning of the end of the classic Resident Evil era. Now, the remake of Resident Evil 2 differs heavily from the original in terms of, well, nearly everything. So let's give some background on that first. The 1998 release featured classic RE gameplay nearly identical to RE1 with some quality of life changes. Tonally, it's very similar to its predecessor with memorable one-liners and awkward acting, but with significant improvements compared to the original. The story saw the return of dual protagonists with a new A and B scenario for each with the zapping system, a mechanic in which certain choices in one A scenario would affect the B scenario of the other character. For example, picking up the side pouch in Claire A would make it inaccessible for Leon B. Bosses and enemy placements would also differ heavily from one scenario to the next. You can probably see where I'm heading with this one, so let's just move on to the remake. The story, same-ish, some story beats were changed significantly. First and second run scenarios replaced the A and B scenarios of the original. Gameplay-wise, completely changed, third-person action-adventure with survival horror elements. Tone, as deadpan serious as you can get. Now, I could go into great detail about each aspect and give a play-by-play of the changes to the original. This game is not a one-to-one nor even an expanded remake like its predecessor. It's a completely new game inspired by the original Resident Evil 2. The gameplay is different, the story beats are different, new areas were added, some areas were cut out entirely. Even the enemies have been simplified down to only a few distinct types. Gone are the giant spiders, crows, and Ivy, with only the Ivy really getting a reimagining that honestly does make them feel like something Umbrella would have cooked up in their labs. I actually really do like them, but I hate fighting them. Considering a slew of changes made in the adaptation, we can properly address the question: is a game that completely reimagines a classic title inferior or superior to a faithful remake? Now, I am no stranger to vocalizing my disdain for this game. Personally, I find it shallow, repetitive, and so far removed from anything resembling a proper Resident Evil game that I cannot even bring myself to play it without actively trying to keep myself from getting bored. All four scenarios are more or less the same in how they play out, with obvious concession to the fact that Leon and Claire have their own side characters with their own unique scenarios. The gameplay feels restrictive, with basic movements and elements being removed from previous entries. It honestly feels like a toned down and stripped down Resident Evil 6. Playing through the game feels more like watching a movie where enemy placements and conflicts play out in nearly the exact same fashion, with very few changes between playthroughs. It's a cynical take that plays it safe just enough to not rock the boat while still having very broad appeal. Yet this is easily one of the most successful titles in the franchise in terms of fan reaction. At release, you couldn't find a person not streaming the game, even up to a month or more afterwards. The speedrun community exploded for the game, and even sparked a return to the original game as well for veteran players and newcomers alike. Yours truly even commentated on a speedrun tournament with Team Redirect back in September. This intense outpouring of love from fans at seeing their childhood favorite reimagined with modern gaming in mind, and immediately captivating the horror community with its ease of play and streamlined design with speedrunning potential, make for a successful remake from a financial point of view, but not necessarily a good or even a great game overall. I find this game to be an inferior, cynical imitation of what was originally a captivating experience in a similar yet different scenario than the first Resident Evil. Which ultimately has brought me to this understanding: a remake does not need to be faithful to be successful, as long as you can appeal to the nostalgia of existing fans and attract newcomers without taking too many risks. And you can bet Capcom is paying attention and listening. Just look at the demo for RE3 and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Like RE3 Nemesis and RE2 Classic before, this game is nearly identical to its predecessor, with some quality of life improvements being made to keep the experience somewhat fresh. It is worth mentioning that from a gameplay perspective, the demo did quell some of my worries. Movement feels better, dynamic dodging returns, and the sub-weapon system has thankfully been taken out and replaced with knives that don't have a hacking health bar. Whose idea was that? That's one of the worst ideas they've ever had. Now it remains to be seen how much has changed since last year's release, and how much the story will differ from the original, but I'm willing to approach the game with cautious optimism and give it a fair shot when it releases on Friday. I only want to see games succeed critically and artistically, and of course financially, but that shouldn't be the only motivation for digging up corpses of past games and reanimate them merely for the sake of a quick buck. Now I know this isn't the only series that is guilty of this, but it sure as heck isn't shy about re-releasing every entry in the series as soon as a new piece of hardware hits the market, with little to no changes. Resident Evil is a series I hold close to my heart despite not being the most complex and thought-provoking, but there's something about the design and presentation that drew me in immediately during my first playthrough of Resident Evil 4. It wasn't until I worked up the courage that fateful day in high school to rep my very first horror game, which took me over 30 hours to complete because I was scared of everything, that I discovered the series that would go on to be the most expansive in my gaming collection. It's just so disheartening for me to see a series that defined survival horror, laid the foundation for modern third-person shooting controls, and prove that not every modern first-person horror game needs to be a pretentious walking simulator, stumble around and retreat, only to release simplified remakes because they are guaranteed to sell millions and lack any of the risks that accompany a new title. Now I plan to revisit this topic after the dust has settled with the RE3 remake release, as I want to see how well this remake honors its predecessor and how it defines itself as a unique entity from last year's entry. But for now, I'll leave you with this. Next time you play a game, it could be retro or modern, your choice, consider your vision for an adaptation and what it would need to keep or remove from the source material that would keep it true to its roots, yet still be recognizable and successful as its own unique entity. Additionally, I'd love to hear what classic game you'd love to see a remake of as we move forward into the next console generation, as it seems like this remake train is not ending anytime soon. That's all from me, thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, a like and a subscription go a long way. Dare I even suggest commenting to let me know your thoughts. This series is supported by you lovely lot on Patreon, which you can find a link to in the description. Additionally, you can find me anywhere social media is pervasive in your life at KyoryuHunter, which is easier to spell than it is to say. But thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Retrosaurus.